Opening the center creates immediate options for piece development and fights for early dominion over key squares. Developing the knight to the f6 square immediately contests the center and prepares for kingside castling, a classic opening principle. Establishing a central pawn duo, white immediately challenges black's knight and prepares for queenside expansion. Preparing a fianchetto, aiming to control the long diagonal and add pressure to white's center. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies the center and prepares for a potential kingside attack, while also keeping options open for pawn advancements. Challenging the center immediately, 3. d5 opens lines and forces white into sharp calculations. Challenging the pawn structure, this move immediately probes for weaknesses and aims to disrupt black's development, potentially creating long-term positional imbalances. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal offers excellent scope, solidifying the kingside and preparing for eventual pawn breaks. Sacrificing pawn structure for piece activity and an open diagonal. Recapturing the bishop strategically unwinds black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines towards their king and creating dynamic counterplay on the dark squares. Striking the pawn opens the c-file, potentially pressuring black's queenside development. Unyielding central pressure builds as black challenges white's pawn structure directly, aiming for dynamic counterplay. Consolidating the pawn center after the exchange, white aims to connect pieces and control key squares. Opening the c-file grants immediate central influence, but requires careful piece coordination to exploit. Forcing a useful check, white immediately probes the dark squares around the black king and prepares for further piece development. Consolidating control of the central squares and preparing for a potential queenside pawn thrust. Exchanging the bishop simplifies the position, allowing white to contest the open files and prepare for queenside pressure. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen tidies up black's pawn structure and prepares for central development. Unleashing the queen to eye the weak pawn on d5 while pressuring the kingside. Securing your monarch now offers vital breathing room, a crucial step to consolidate your forces against potential central pressure. Seizing the central pawn opens up the queenside, but leaves your king less defended. Asserting control over the open d-file is a priority, preventing white from easily consolidating their central pawn majority. Exchanging queens simplifies to an endgame where black enjoys better piece coordination. Opening lines are now clear, and your knight embarks on a quest to control central squares from its new outpost. Strengthening the kingside pawn chain offers white a spatial advantage and prepares for future queenside activity. Establishing dominion over the open c-file injects immediate pressure, promising enhanced piece activity. Developing the knight to its natural outpost aims to solidify control over key central squares. Expanding on the queenside, black initiates a dynamic pawn thrust, aiming to gain space and potentially create counterplay against white's central pawn structure. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, especially with open lines and potential tactics. Securing the queenside and preparing for queenside expansion, this pawn advance subtly challenges white's kingside control. Asserting control over the crucial central file, this move prepares to pressure black's queenside pawn chain. Asserting control over the c4 square, the knight prepares to infiltrate enemy territory, aiming for deeper penetration. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain now allows white to prepare for a kingside pawn advance or central break later. A sensible placement, preparing to challenge that central pawn structure and activate the knight. Repositioning the knight to e2 prepares a future kingside expansion and aims to bolster the central pawn structure. Proposing a knight centralization, this pawn structure manipulation aims to provoke weaknesses and ultimately gain initiative on the queenside. Clearing the central file opens avenues for immediate pressure and potential piece activity, aiming to exploit black's potentially uncoordinated queenside. Exchanging the rook solidifies control of the open file and prepares for a more active queen endgame. Asserting control over the open file, white aims to pressure black's pawn structure. The rook exchange simplifies, but opens the c-file for aggressive pawn pushes and potential knight infiltration. Reclaiming the knight solidifies white's central presence, preparing to activate pieces for the upcoming endgame battle. Repositioning the bishop to a more active square, aiming to redeploy it later for influence. A proactive development to seize the initiative on the kingside, forcing black's knight to retreat and potentially limiting its scope. Injecting immediate diagonal activity, this check forces white's king to reposition, potentially exposing it further as queens are off the board. Relocating the monarch to the queenside aims to escape the open file and prepare for the upcoming pawn endgame dynamics. Instantly solidifying pawn structure, this allows the bishop to escape its passive post and eye the kingside. Fortifying the king's shelter from diagonal threats, this pawn push initiates a slow positional tightening. Fortifying the pawn chain and initiating a slow positional grind, aiming to gain space on the kingside. Asserting the knight's dominance on c6 creates a menacing outpost, restricting black's pieces and building pressure on the queenside. Inviting the enemy bishop to a vulnerable outpost, disrupting the pawn structure. Unleashing tactical possibilities, this pawn thrust disrupts black's bishop placement and opens lines. Trading pawns opens the path for your knight to infiltrate and create immediate threats. King finds a central outpost, actively participating in the endgame battle. Restoring the king to central activity, this maneuver seeks to activate the monarch and create counterplay on the kingside. Reinforcing the knight on the advanced outpost offers a vital pawn break opportunity. This bishop repositions, seeking activity on the g1 square, a crucial outpost for potential future kingside operations. Securing the king's position on the light squares allows for a more active pawn push. Injecting activity into the knight, this aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. Opening this queenside pawn structure provides a welcome touch of dynamism, preventing the knight from becoming too entrenched. Intriguing counterplay emerges as the knight pierces into enemy territory, eyeing potential weaknesses. Aggressively seizing the initiative, this pawn push aims to exploit the exposed black knight and disrupt any potential queenside coordination. Opening that queenside path aims to activate the bishop, but could allow white's knight more central influence. Seizing an open file for piece activity, white creates immediate pawn tension by forcing a capture. Suddenly, the knight finds a surprisingly active post, disrupting white's pawn structure and threatening a deep invasion. Reclaiming the initiative, the knight aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and establish a powerful outpost. A crucial decision to maintain piece activity and prevent the white knight from establishing a dominant outpost. Securing the pawn's advance toward the queenside, this prepares a potential pawn storm or simply reinforces the structure. Solidifying the pawn structure prevents white's knight from advancing further and offers the king a safe haven. Seizing a pawn with the knight opens clear lines for its eventual regrouping to a more active square. Capturing the bishop strategically simplifies the position, but look out for counterplay on the now open queenside. Regaining the pawn with the knight repositions it to a central, active square. The bishop retreats, consolidating its position after the pawn capture, and prepares to support a potential kingside pawn push. Pushing the pawn forward opens a pathway for the rook to support the knight's advance. Reclaiming the initiative, the knight's maneuver to the queenside opens up counterplay and challenges white's pawn structure. Reactivating the knight to centralize and support pawn advances will be key for white. Initiating a determined pawn advance, the king boldly seeks active squares amidst the scattered enemy structure. Initiating a regrouping maneuver to bolster the knight's defensive posture and prepare for a potential pawn advance. Unleashing kingside dynamism, black bravely sacrifices pawn structure for an assault on the white monarch's safety. Targeting the black king's escape square with a check forces a reaction, disrupting black's potential counterplay. The king bravely ventures into the center, seeking shelter among its own pawns. Activating the knight to a central outpost aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and create attacking opportunities. Pushing the h-pawn advances black's queenside pawn majority, seeking to create counterplay and disrupt white's coordination. Capitalizing on the open file, this pawn push aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create new attacking avenues for white's pieces. Embracing the chaos, black's king ventures forth, creating dynamic counterplay amidst the material imbalance. Unleashing a check forces the king into a more exposed position, potentially simplifying into a favorable king and pawn endgame for white. A bold choice that risks exposing the king further after the pawn capture, potentially inviting a counterattack. Capturing the pawn creates immediate space for the knight to maneuver toward the center. Unleashing the king's power by opening a diagonal for the bishop offers dynamic counterplay. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn push and restrict black's king. Unleashing the knight to disrupt white's pawn structure and challenge the central advance. Activating the knight to a more central outpost prepares to contest the file. Capturing the knight frees up black's king and pawn structure, opening the door for counterplay on the queen side. Capturing the bishop solidifies pawn structure and opens a pathway for the king's advance towards the center. A bold bid to activate the king, aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed monarch in this endgame. Relocating the monarch to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn majority on the king side. Shifting the knight to a more active square prepares to contest the central pawn majority. Reinforcing the knight on c3 is crucial for controlling the central squares and preparing a potential kingside pawn advance. The knight retreats, aiming to redeploy and contest the d5 pawn, a strategic repositioning for future action. Unleashing the knight's potential, this move prepares to blockade black's advancing pawns and gain a crucial outpost. The black king scrambles for safety, initiating a desperate flight from the menacing knight and pawn advancements. Unleashing pawns from their defensive post attempts to pry open black's defenses and create counterplay.